Surah 76. This surah seems to be fairly late, though in its basis probably still Meccan. The beginning of it arose perhaps out of some gibe of the unbelievers at some statement such as Surah 19, ayat 68. It summarizes Allah's goodness to man, and it ends by indicating the different fates of the grateful and ungrateful. At some later time, probably in Medina, verse 5, which had closed the passage, was left aside all but the first two words, and a definition of the virtuous added in verse 7 through 10, followed by a fuller description of their reward, verse 11 through 22. This later is inextricable confusion from verse 15 onward, and any reconstruction must be regarded as merely tentative. Verse 14 was probably followed by 21 and 19. These were removed in favor of 15 and 17. Later, 18 was substituted for the latter half of 17. Well, not substituted because it's still there and whatnot, because of wine being implied in it. And with 20, with 19 and 22 added with 21. At the same time, verse 6 was substituted for verse 5. Well, not substituted, 6 with verse 5 as remaining part of the passage. 16 may have been with 15, but see the note. The remainder of the surah consists of separate pieces which seem to have little connection with what precedes or with each other. Verse 29 might connect with 23 to 26, but rather a contradictory addition. You know, there's no contradiction in the Qur'an, but, you know, it doesn't make sense to Richard Bell if things were being edited like this, how, well, you know, so he can't make any sense of the editing process in certain respects. Having been in 30 and 31, these verses probably discarded. Well, if they were discarded, why are they in there? Okay. So, and writing of 27 and 28 with them. Al-Insan, chapter of man. Dahr, the time, also called that. The generation of the human. Okay. 1 to 21. The prophet exhorted to confidence and patience. Meccan, 23 to 26. Disregarded judgment. Medinan. So they disregard, as in they leave behind them. They give glory the night long. You know, perhaps giving, you know, glorifying God throughout the night, which is important when you're awake, regardless of what you're doing, right? The salsabil, the origin is quite unknown. Is that seeking the way? What's that mean? The measure. So the meaning of the phrase interpreted as meaning that the blessed determine the size by their desires are the good works in this life, and that the cupbearers measure out the contents liberally. Not what we mean by liberal, some political nonsense, but the 15b and 16, there's a really unintelligible why. That makes sense. The perhaps the gloss is mixed with the text, and we should translate in goblets. Kawarir, receptacles, gloss. Kawarir were of silver and highly esteemed. So now, light glass, so they're saying the certain level of fineness of it has a glass quality to it, whether it's that smooth or whatever. And so a meaning of a word is uncertain. Okay, let me see if I can get this one. Okay, they give out of love of God, they give out of love for, you know, they give out of what they love. Okay, that makes sense. Then neither sun and cold, you know, they're not facing the hardships of the extremes of temperature. That's pretty easy to understand. The testing, following a suggestion of Barth, has been transferred from the previous verse. Okay, why? Ungrateful as in unbelieving. So Surah 77, at the beginning of 1 through 7 stands a series of asseverations leading up to a statement of the certainty of the threatened punishment, which for the emphasis is out of rhyme. The asseverations, participles in the feminine plural, 37, 1 through 4, are mysterious and no one can guess at its reference. The threatened punishment is not necessarily eschatological, but when 8 through 13 were conjoined with it, it was intended to be taken as such. These verses describe the judgment day, here called the day of distinction, that is the day when the evil are separated from the good. The rest of the surah is an explanation of the phrase in the form of a description. This is probably Medinan, or at least very late Meccan, but it contains other material. Either the explanation really begins at verse 34 and has been written on the back of earlier pieces, which were afterwards incorporated into it by the prefixing of a kind of refrain to each, or the first part of the explanation has been built up from these earlier pieces bound together by the refrain. The latter is the simpler supposition has been adopted. These pieces are 16 through 18, which seem to imply the destruction of the unbelieving communities rather than the last day. Verse 20 to 23, 25 to 27, which deal with signs, and, well, they're all signs, but, verse 30 to 33, which are not quite certainly a unity, but may be so read, describing the fate of the wicked. From 34 onwards, we seem to have a continuous composition, though at the end of it deals rather with the conduct of the unbelievers in the present and with their fate in the future. Surah al-Mursalat, the chapter of those that are sent. What is predicted will certainly come. Meccan, first 7 verses, sent gently are one after another. The passage is usually interpreted as referring to angels and their various activities, but more probably it's the winds bringing up the storm clouds, which give the picture of approaching doom. Verse 6 is not very intelligible on either interpretation and is perhaps a latter insertion. The reminder comes as excuse for more. It makes sense. I don't know what the issue is. The judgment day, Meccan, 8 through 13. The stars blotted out. Ibn Masud and Ubay read the verb in 8 through 12 as in the first person singular. I blotted out, etc. This may be the original reading. And the appointment made. Oh wait, no, that's a question mark. Explanation of the day of distinction, late Meccan or early Medinan, 14 through 50. Okay. So the inclusive place, the meaning not quite certain, inclusive of various kinds of land, living, productive, some dead, some dried up, some barren, and the shadow 3-branched kind of makes you think of what you do at Hodge. You're addressing the 3 shadow with the 3 stoning, but the smoke of hell rising in 3 columns. So then we get Surah 78. The verses at the beginning, 1 through 5, have a different rhyme from the rest and have been prefixed later, perhaps in Medina as an introduction. The earliest part of the surah is probably the section on the signs, verse 6 to 16. Although this is not quite an early treatment, but the subject is just possible that it might belong to the same time as the passage which follows. Dealing with the day of distinction, though it is unlikely that it was originally designed to lead up to this, the same rhyme, however, continues. This passage, 17 through 36, consists of a description of the day and the descriptions of the different faiths, the transgressors, and the pious. The first extends from 17 to 20. The fate of the transgressors is described in 21 to 26, 25 being perhaps an addition, 27 to 30 are almost certainly an addition from a latter time. The fate of the pious occupies 31 to 36, but 33, 34 probably have been inserted later. Verse 37 to 41 certainly did not belong to the original surah, but were added as a further description of the day of judgment. It is a little doubtful whether 40, 41 are connected with the rest, but they connect well enough with the rest in the context of sense. Well, that's always, but again, they're trying to form this chronological order here. Surat An-Naba, the chapter of the announcement. Disputers will know in time, Medinan 1 through 5, signs of Allah's power in creation, Meccan 6 through 16. And so that first note, the blazing, the sun, because the sunlight and the moonlight is distinguished. The last day, Meccan with later additions, 17 through 41. And Surah 38:57 connects with the thing of the hot water and tears part. Surah 79, the variation of the rhyme, shows that this surah is, well, it is a unity, but songs have to be entirely the same riff the entire time. The pieces of which is composed are easily distinguishable, but it is not so easy to say how they came to stand as they do. The first piece begins with a series of asseverations similar to those in 37, 1 through 4, and 77, 1 through 5, the interpretation of which is quite uncertain. The statement which follows, verse 5, 6, and 7, is in a different rhyme, as is quite in order to in such passages. It refers to the judgment and is followed in the same rhyme by a dramatic representation of the unbelievers at the resurrection. Verses 8 through 14, the story of Moses, is in a different rhyme and is clearly out of connection. It is an earlier version of the story and no doubt owes its position here to having stood on the back of verse 1 through 14. Verse 27 to 33 have again a different rhyme and do not connect with either of the preceding passages. They consist of a passage on the signs, which has been adapted by the addition of 27a and 33 to the form of an address to the people. Verse 34 to 41 have the same rhyme as the story of Moses, but in a sense connect rather than the beginning of the surah. They seem in fact to be the considerable later addition to that passage describing the fate of evil and good. Verse 42 to 46 deal with the question as to when the last day will come, as to which Muhammad disclaims any knowledge. They have the same rhyme as 27 to 33 and seem to be earlier than 34 to 41. The probability is that they are a discarded passage, the back of which, along with that of 27 to 33, are used for the writing of 34 to 41. These latter are the latest part of the surah and may be Medinan. The other parts are Meccan, probably different dates. This writing on the back thing it's a weird, senseless comment, but it sounds, you know, profound. Oh, they're editing and here's a bunch of scraps and they're putting things together. Yeah. Surah An-Naziat, chapter of those that draw. The resurrection and judgment, 1 through 14, fairly late Meccan. The story of Moses, Meccan, 15 through 25. And so drawing full stretch, the simile taken from the drawing of the bow. The meaning of verse 1 through 5 is quite uncertain. The translation takes them as referring to Meccan business life. The participles agreeing perhaps with souls, but the usual interpretation regards them as referring to the angels of death, drawing the souls of men from their bodies. The quake shall come, referring to the earthquake, which heralds the judgment day. That which rides behind the resurrection also departs from the usual interpretation. The meaning is uncertain, and the word usually said to mean original state, and brought back as we were before, literally in the waking. Oh, there's original state. Well, spiritually, we're supposed to uphold nature and restore nature and establish nature rather than this misuse of nature that people tend to call their nature. But anyways, verse 12 of Surah 20, the Holy Valley of Tua, you know, those two lands in Egypt. And okay, at first, seized of the last and the first. So of all ages, taking example hereafter and in this world. Oh, 26 is the end of that. Allah's power, Meccan adopted, 27 to 33, fate of the evil and the good, 34 to 41, 42 to 46, when will the last day come? And I guess maybe I should divide this to 5 chapters a bit. Surah 80, this surah consists of a number of separate pieces which have been put together as to form more or less of unity. The first 1 through 10 shows the prophet perturbed by the failure of his methods of persuasion applied to the wealthy and in search of new means of affecting them. The second, verse 11 through 15, shows that he's found a message which he regards to be able to stand by its own authority, a message probably not as usually held, contained in a book written in heaven, but contained and carefully preserved in books of former revelation. The third, verse 16 to 21, deals with the man's ingratitude or unbelief. It states how Allah has created man and revealed the way of life, which man has not followed. The fourth piece contains the same subject, but is probably a separate early passage on the signs adapted to its position here by the addition of verses 24 and 32. The concluding section 33 to 42 deal with the resurrection and judgment. Verse 34 to 37 has been substituted for 38 to 41 at a later stage. This may possibly be Medinan, but the surah as a whole is Meccan. Surah Abasa, chapter of He Frowned, in the name of Allah, the Compassion of the Merciful. Not reading the whole chapter, but so 1 through 10, Muhammad reproved for his attention to the rich, fairly early Meccan. Of course, in the Shia tradition, and that aside from a couple people coming through, it was actually somebody other than Muhammad. But even the comment says that it doesn't seem possible. It's probably one of the rich Meccans or one of his companions that wanted to focus on the people who were powerful, like the Scientology approach, basically. I mean, they get the common people, but they, focus on those that they think have money. That's why Scientology's got richer as its membership has shrunk. Even Ekankar, I think, has got richer as its membership has shrunk. But purifying the self, such is meaning of the tasada, that is usually said to be tasaddad, to give attention to. The echo, that's the word being referred to. The independent, as in rich, the purifying by giving alms. Okay, comment a little bit wrong, but the being in fear, for his own soul's safety. The sublimity of the message, 11 through 15, man's ingratitude, 16 through 23, signs for man's consideration, early, 24 to 32, the last day, Meccan Revised, 33 to 37. So gloomy, like as in dust upon them, the earth in cracks, the growing plant pushes its way through the cracked ground, the way of life, made easy, the revelation. And